So in this video, we're going to continue on with our discussion about political equality. We've already talked about this idea of one person, one vote. But along with that, there is the idea that for a democracy to be functioning, for popular sovereignty to work, everybody has to be able to vote, right? People need to be able to vote. Not everybody, right? Obviously, we don't want children voting, but I'm sure that most of you know that in the history of the United States, it has not been the case that all adults or all citizens have been able to vote. As a matter of fact, in the Constitution, the original Constitution, prior to any amendments, there was nothing that guaranteed the right to vote. Initially, the right to vote was left to the states. And in the early versions of the country, the early history, basically most states restricted the vote to males who own property, right? And there can't be political equality if the vote is limited to only white males who own property. Now, eventually, they expanded it to non-landowning states, but there were some states that even only permitted Christian men to vote for a while. But again, eventually, non-landowning males were allowed to vote as well, and there weren't the restrictions on based on religion. Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment passed. The 15th Amendment, and by the way, you don't need to memorize all this. The 15th Amendment passed, and that extended the right to vote to blacks, right, to the newly freed slaves. 50 years later, the 19th Amendment passed, and women were given the right to vote. And then in 1924, the federal government passed something called the Snyder Act. This is 1924, and Native Americans were given the right to vote. Then in 1964, and then probably 1964 seems like a long time ago, like ancient history to some of you. But keep in mind, I was born in 1958, so this is in my lifetime. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution made poll taxes unconstitutional. You couldn't do it because what would happen is people would come to go vote, and they would be charged essentially money. They would have to pay a fee, and so poor people couldn't vote. And so in 1964 they got rid of that. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, passed, and this essentially prevented the South from prohibiting blacks from registering to vote. That's what was happening in the South. They couldn't prevent blacks from voting because the 15th Amendment made it unconstitutional to try and prevent them from voting. So instead, they prevented them from registering to vote through a variety of means. So 65 expands the franchise, is the way it's called, how you refer to it. It expands the number of people who can vote. Then the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971 that reduced the voting age to 18 years. In 1975, laws were passed that protected language minorities to ensure that they could get ballots that were in their own language. And in 1982, there were laws passed that ensured that people with disabilities could vote. As you increase the number of people who are permitted to vote, that's called expanding the franchise. I don't know why they call it that, but it's expanding the franchise. And so where we are today is the franchise has been expanded quite a bit. There are still people who can't vote. People who've been adjudicated, shown to be in a court of law, not mentally fit, aren't allowed to vote. Non-citizens are not allowed to vote. People below 18 are not allowed to vote. And this is pretty much understood and accepted. But there is one group of people who qualify in every other way to be able to vote, but are not permitted to vote. And those are felons. These are either people who are in jail, people who have served their time and are on parole or on probation. And there's an ongoing discussion about whether or not people who have been convicted of felonies should be allowed to vote. So I want you to listen to this, watch this video, and then we'll come back and I'll pose some questions to you.
Felon voting. Should felons be allowed to vote? In the United States, an estimated 5.85 million people are not allowed to vote in elections because they have a felony conviction. This is a condition known as disenfranchisement. Felon voting laws vary by state. In 2 states, convicted felons can vote by absentee ballot while they're in prison. In 36 states and Washington, D.C., felons have their vote restored after they finish serving their terms or after they finish their periods of parole or probation. In 12 states, some felons can lose their ability to vote permanently. Should felons be allowed to vote? When felons have served their sentences and repaid their debt to society, their punishment is complete and they deserve to regain their fundamental rights. Felons whose right to vote is restored are at least 2/3 less likely to return to prison. Disenfranchisement laws are a form of racial discrimination. African Americans represent 12.6% of the US population, but they make up over 38% of the US prison population due to racial bias in the criminal justice system. More than 1 in 8 black men are disenfranchised in the United States. Disenfranchisement is a political strategy of mass electoral suppression by Republicans. In 2000, the presidential election between Al Gore and George W. Bush was decided by 537 votes in Florida, a state that had 750,000 disenfranchised voters at the time. An estimated 73% of felons would vote for Democratic candidates, so if those people had been allowed to vote, Gore would certainly have carried the state and the election. However, when somebody breaks the public trust by committing a crime, they forfeit their right to take part in the democratic process. A person who breaks the law should not make the law. After all, the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution says that a state can deny the vote to those participating in rebellion or other crime. There is nothing unreasonable about felons losing some rights and privileges. They can also lose their Second Amendment rights, their ability to serve on a jury, their ability to receive welfare checks and food stamps, their eligibility for financial aid to attend college, and sometimes they can lose their parental rights. Besides, we don't let children vote, and we don't let non-citizens vote. Neither should we allow felons to vote. The call for felon voting is a political ploy by Democrats, who stand to gain the most votes. As we know, an estimated 73% of felons would vote for Democratic candidates, so it's no coincidence that one poll found 48% of Democrats favouring felon voting, with only 17% of Republicans feeling the same way. So, should felons be allowed to vote? Should they lose that right while they complete their sentences? Or should they lose the right to vote forever? What do you think?
So I just want to make one comment about the pros and the cons that they offered in that video, which I thought was fairly good. Just looking at it from a principled perspective, as somebody who believes very much in the right to vote, part of the argument that they make had to do with which political party would benefit from felons being able to vote. You know, if they've served their time, if they're off probation, all that kind of stuff. Personally, and if you view this differently, I'd be interested in hearing your views either on your discussion board or on the current events page. I don't think this decision should be made on the basis of partisan advantage. It should be made on the basis of principle. I don't want to suggest to you that partisan advantage isn't part of what's going on when people are making these proposals, but there are a group of people who are very much dedicated to the idea that everybody should be allowed to vote. And there are oftentimes people who are in the prison system who feel as though they've been the victims of a system that they are probably in a better situation to be able to suggest alternatives. Whether you agree with that or not is, again, your own decision. But the idea that, I think for me at least, the idea that people should lose the right to vote permanently um, after they've served their time, after they've been on parole, after they've served probation, is problematic. But again, you might view it differently. But this is all around the question of political equality. In the next one, we're going to talk about equal protection under the law. And once again, we're going to be talking about the prison system and how justice is meted out and if it's done in a way where people are treated equally.